Hey guys, Josh here. Today I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while now, remote work versus RTO, or return to office. Over the past few years, remote work exploded during the pandemic, but here we are in 2024 and many companies are pushing hard for people to return to the office. The big question is why? Is it really necessary? Is it more productive? Is it better for the bottom line? Based on the data that I've seen and my own personal experience, I'm really not so sure. What got me thinking about this even more was a thread I came across on Reddit. There was a lot of interesting comments about RTO, and I want to highlight a few of them because they really capture how so many of us are feeling right now. One person mentioned how they've been working remotely and never want to go back because of the awful commute. Another shared how they drive to the office just to sit on Zoom calls all day, the same thing they could be doing at home. And then there was a comment that really stood out to me. Someone said that supporting the downtown economy isn't their responsibility and questioned whether cities are pushing companies to bring people back to the office to save their real estate investments. This all got me thinking about the bigger picture, how RTO impacts not just individual workers, but also urban economies, landlords, and even the future of our cities. Are we seeing the start of a long-term shift away from traditional office spaces? And if so, what does that mean for the industries that depend on them? So in this video, I'm going to break it all down. We're going to dive deep into why companies are pushing for RTO, what this means for cities, and whether remote work is here to stay. Spoiler alert, I don't think RTO is going to win this battle long term, but we'll get into that later. Let's go ahead and get started. The state of RTO versus remote work, where we are now. Remote work started as a quick fix during the pandemic, but has since transformed the way many companies and employees think about work. Yet, despite the clear benefits and productivity boosts for many, there's been a really strong push recently for some companies to bring people back to the office. So what's really going on? If you look at what's happening on a larger scale, the landscape is really just split. Some companies have fully embraced remote or hybrid work models, while others are clinging to the traditional office setup. The comments I mentioned earlier on Reddit illustrate how workers feel about this. Many want to stay remote, and for good reason. They avoid long commutes, get more flexibility, and feel generally more productive. But here's where it gets tricky. A lot of this push for RTO isn't about productivity. It's about commercial real estate. Cities and landlords are feeling the pressure because office spaces have been sitting empty for over 4 years now in many places. And that has a huge impact on local economies. Restaurants, public transit, and even parking garages are suffering. One commenter pointed out how they're now paying $65 a month just to park near their office, a cost that wouldn't even exist if they were still working from home. Some people even suggested that cities might be pressuring companies to bring workers back to the office to save these local economies, rather than it being in the best interest of the businesses themselves. That's a really interesting point because when you think about it, the biggest winners of RTO aren't the companies, but the urban infrastructure built around office life. The bigger question is, are we just delaying the inevitable? Just like industries have shifted in the past, think whale oil or coal, are we seeing the beginning of the end for large-scale office spaces? Maybe it's time for cities to adapt and transform rather than trying to hold on to a past model that no longer works for most businesses. Section 3. The impact on urban economies. When considering the broader effects of remote work on cities, there's a clear trend. Urban economies are feeling the strain. Since the rise of work from home, major downtown areas have seen significant declines in foot traffic, which has had a domino effect on local businesses and services that once thrived on office workers. Commercial real estate has been hit particularly hard. Vacancy rates for office spaces in major cities such as New York and San Francisco remain alarmingly high. As of 2023, office occupancy rates in some cities struggled to reach 50%, and nationwide, office usage was just at 60%. Many office buildings have been sitting largely empty for years. This drop in demand has also reduced tax revenues for cities, which in turn impacts funding for public services like infrastructure, transit, and public safety. But while the conversation often revolves around the immediate effects of remote work, I think there's a deeper issue here. I recently read The Vanishing Middle Class by Peter Temin, and I found it incredibly relevant to this discussion. Temin argues that the decline of the middle class, driven by factors like deindustrialization, educational inequality, and systemic racial disparities, has weakened the economic foundation of the country. Middle-class jobs, which once contributed to the vitality of urban infrastructure and services, are disappearing. Temin's analysis suggests that the decline of urban infrastructure isn't just about remote work or empty office buildings. It's a symptom of a much larger problem, the hollowing out of the middle class. With fewer middle-income earners contributing to local economies and tax bases, cities are struggling to maintain their public services and infrastructure. This directly ties into the urban doom loop some economists have warned about, where cities lose both tax revenue and economic vitality as people leave urban centers and reduce their spending downtown. What's happening now could be seen as an attempt by cities to prop up urban economies that were already under strain, long before remote work became a major factor. For example, the push for return to office isn't just about corporate productivity. It's about trying to restore some level of normalcy to cities that heavily rely on the daily influx of office workers. That said, this approach might only delay the inevitable. Much like the industries that faded away due to technological disruption, like whale oil and coal, we could be witnessing a long-term shift away from the traditional office model. If cities want to survive and thrive, they may need to adapt to this new reality, perhaps by rethinking how they use urban spaces or by diversifying their economies beyond the office-heavy model. In short, while the challenges remote work poses to cities are real, they are also part of a broader, more structural decline that Temen's work also highlights. The vanishing middle class plays a key role in urban struggles, and solving these issues will require more than just filling office buildings again. It will require addressing the systemic inequalities that have been eroding the middle class for decades. The whale oil analogy, technological shifts, and industry obsolescence. Building on the discussion of urban economies and middle class decline, it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture. We're in the middle of a significant technological and societal shift, one that's challenging long-standing industries and ways of working. To illustrate this, I want to go back to the whale oil analogy, which I think is incredibly relevant right now. Think about it. For those of you who don't know, whale oil was once a crucial resource for lighting lamps, powering homes, and driving the economy. Entire industries from whaling ships to processing plants were built around this resource. But as technology advanced and we discovered alternatives such as kerosene and electricity, the need for whale oil dwindled. The industry and its ecosystem faded, and society moved on. We didn't artificially sustain whaling just because it used to be important. We adapted. In a similar way, we might be seeing the beginning of the end for traditional office spaces. The push for return to office feels like an effort to hold on to a system that is becoming increasingly obsolete. Why is that? The pandemic showed us that many jobs can be done remotely and often more efficiently. In fact, studies from 2023 found that remote work increased productivity by up to 5%. Largely because workers saved time on commutes and had fewer office distractions. Despite this, many cities and industries reliant on office work are struggling. Office vacancy rates in major urban areas remain high, and the decline in foot traffic is hurting restaurants, public transportation systems, and local businesses that depend on office workers. While some argue that companies are bringing people back to the office to boost productivity, others speculate that cities and commercial real estate stakeholders are pressuring businesses to do so in order to maintain economic stability. While there's no direct evidence of widespread lobbying to force RTO, it's easy to see how the interests of local governments and commercial landlords align with keeping office spaces full. The situation bears striking similarities to the whale oil industry. Cities and landlords built their economic models around centralized office work, and now they're struggling to adapt to the reality of remote work. But much like the decline of whale oil, trying to hold on to an outdated system by pushing people back into offices might just delay the inevitable. Rather than resisting change, cities and businesses should be looking for ways to innovate. This could include converting unused office space into housing, creating co-working hubs, or investing in industries that thrive in a more decentralized, remote work-friendly world. In the end, just as society moved on from whale oil, we may need to accept that the traditional office model is fading. That doesn't mean offices will disappear entirely. Some hybrid work will likely continue for quite a while, but we're seeing the beginning of a broader transformation. Embracing this change rather than trying to fight it will be the key to building more adaptable and resilient urban economies in the future. The role of government and subsidies. Who really benefits? Let's take a moment to examine how government subsidies and lobbying often prop up industries long after their relevance has diminished. A clear example of this can be seen in the food industry. The US government heavily subsidizes sectors like meat and dairy, even though there's growing evidence that diets rich in fresh fruits and fresh vegetables are better for public health. Why is that? It comes down to political influence. These industries have really strong lobbying efforts that ensure continued support, even while it might not be in the public's best interest. When we look at the push for return to office, we might be seeing a similar pattern. While there's no concrete evidence of widespread lobbying directly forcing companies back into the office, the economic incentives for cities and landlords are undeniable. Empty office spaces threaten local economies that depend on commercial real estate for tax revenue and business. Cities have a vested interest in keeping those offices occupied, and the alignment of interests between commercial landlords and local governments may be driving this push, even if it's not always explicit. This dynamic mirrors other instances where industries are artificially sustained, like coal or fossil fuels, long after their decline was clear. These industries benefit from subsidies and protections for years, delaying their inevitable decline. Commercial real estate seems to be following the same trajectory, with some cities slow to adapt to the rise of remote work. So the question becomes, should we continue to prop up these industries? Just like with fossil fuels or whale oil, it might be time to let the market and technology drive the next evolution of how we live and work. Instead of clinging to old models, cities and businesses should embrace change and look for opportunities to adapt to the new reality of hybrid and remote work. By continuing to artificially support industries that no longer align with current needs, we risk stifling innovation. The push for RTO may benefit landlords and certain urban economies, but it doesn't necessarily align with the data showing that remote work can be more productive and beneficial for employees. It's worth questioning whether these efforts are truly about productivity or just about protecting entrenched interests. Is the financial argument for RTO valid? One of the most persistent claims from companies pushing for a return to office is that it's a more financially sound decision. But is that really the case? Let's break down whether there's any solid data to support the idea that bringing employees back into the office is better for the bottom line. First off, the cost of maintaining large office spaces is significant. Rent, utilities, maintenance, and other overhead costs add up very quickly, especially in high-demand urban centers. During the pandemic, many companies realized they could cut down on these expenses by embracing remote or hybrid work. A 2023 study showed that remote work led to significant cost savings for businesses, particularly in reduced office space requirements and associated operational costs. On the employee side, remote work has clear financial benefits. Workers save money on commuting, meals, and work attire. A survey conducted by Owl Labs in 2022 found that employees working remotely could save up to $4,000 a year by avoiding these costs. This adds up to increased satisfaction and potentially higher productivity, as employees experience less stress and greater flexibility in their work-life balance. Now let's talk a little bit about productivity. The data here shows mixed results, but generally remote work has been found to either maintain or improve productivity for many industries. A Stanford University study from 2020 found that remote workers were 13% more productive than their in-office counterparts. Additionally, companies that adopted a remote-first approach during the pandemic reported fewer sick days and higher employee retention rates, both of which contribute to lower operational costs. These benefits challenge the idea that being in the office lead to higher productivity across the board. On the flip side, advocates for RTO argue that certain types of work, such as collaboration, innovation, and team building, suffer when employees aren't physically together. Some companies believe that in-office work fosters better communication and culture, which may be true for specific industries or teams. But is that worth the additional overhead and the dissatisfaction many employees feel when forced back into the office? That's where the financial argument starts to break down. Additionally, some companies may be pushing for RTO out of a need to justify the long-term leases they've signed on commercial real estate. The sunk costs associated with these leases, especially in high-rent areas, may incentivize businesses to use the space they're already paying for, even if it's not the most financially or operationally efficient strategy. Ultimately, the data does not strongly support the argument that RTO is the most financially prudent option, especially when considering the savings associated with remote work and the growing dissatisfaction among employees forced back into offices. The companies that are thriving post-pandemic seem to be the ones that have embraced flexibility, allowing workers to choose the environment in which they're most productive, rather than mandating a return to office based on outdated models. The financial argument for RTO may make sense in certain cases, particularly for companies that depend on in-person collaboration or have already invested heavily in office spaces. However, for many businesses, remote work or even a hybrid model seems to offer better financial and operational outcomes. As the workplace continues to evolve, it's likely that the most successful companies will be the ones that adapt to these new realities, rather than clinging to the old ways of working. Concluding thoughts: the future of work and urban economies. As we look towards the future, it's clear that the debate over remote work and return to office is about far more than just where people work. It's about the changing nature of cities, economies, and how we adapt to new technological realities. Over the last several sections, we've explored the economic, social, and political forces driving this conversation, and the patterns are hard to ignore. Just like industries of the past, the office-centric business model may be on its way out. For urban economies, this transition poses both a challenge and an opportunity. Cities that once thrived on the daily influx of office workers are now faced with empty buildings, declining tax revenues, and the need to rethink how they structure their economies. But, as we've discussed, it's not the first time industries have been forced to evolve. Just as cities eventually moved on from coal plants and whaling docks, they'll need to adapt to a world where remote work and hybrid models are increasingly the norm. The whale oil analogy we discussed earlier helps frame this transformation. It's not about whether office work is inherently bad or good. It's about whether it still makes sense in a world that's rapidly shifting to digital, decentralized models of productivity. As companies realize the benefits of remote work, such as higher productivity, lower costs, and greater employee satisfaction, the financial argument for RTO weakens. That said, the transition won't be simple. The push for RTO is partly driven by the sunk costs of commercial real estate and the economic incentives of cities that depend on office life. But this doesn't mean we should cling to the outdated systems. In fact, trying to artificially prop up these industries, whether through subsidies or policies, could stifle the innovation and progress that remote work has unlocked. Looking ahead, the most forward-thinking cities and companies will be those that embrace flexibility and adaptability. Rather than forcing a return to office spaces that may no longer be necessary, these leaders will look for ways to repurpose commercial real estate, invest in local economies, and create a more dynamic and resilient future. As we close out this discussion, it's important to recognize that the future of remote work is still evolving. Remote work isn't going away, and hybrid models are likely to dominate. The challenge for businesses and urban economies will be to find ways to adapt and thrive in this new environment, rather than resisting the inevitable changes that come with technological and societal shifts. So what's your take? Do you think RTO is the future, or are we heading toward a more flexible, remote-first world? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we're headed and how you think businesses and cities should adapt to this new reality. And with that, I want to thank you so much for watching. If you got anything out of this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I make new videos every week, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.